Okay, I think that's my cue. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here this morning on a Saturday morning. And we hope that you and yours are all safe and doing well after the tropical storm Helene. My name is Shanti Elise Prasad. I am an advocacy manager with Stop AAPI Hate and Chinese for Affirmative Action. And we are missing being together in person. I had hoped to meet many of you, but we hope that this will still be an impactful event for everyone. Thank you to our speakers for pivoting to join us virtually as well. We're very excited to partner with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta to bring you this event and important discussion. And we hope by the end of the event that you have learned more about the history and current rise in anti-Asian scapegoating, including both the rhetoric we are hearing politically and the policies that are being introduced, particularly land bans that are targeting the Asian and Asian American communities in Georgia and across the country. And we hope that you also can what all you can do to understand, you can learn all you can understand your rights and help defeat this law in Georgia. So first off, I'd like to introduce Manju Kulkarni. Manju had the foresight to co-found Stop AAPI Hate to track the acts of hate and violence our communities were experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she's also the executive director of AAPI Equity Alliance and our moderator for today's panel discussion. Please welcome Manju. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shanti. And thank you all for joining us today. It's a real honor and privilege for me to be with you all. Apologies, we cannot be in person. And I want to first express my deepest condolences to the Atlanta community, and especially to those who've lost loved ones as a result of Hurricane Helene, and also others who've experienced injury and other types of loss. We know that with climate change, so much of these things are happening with frequency, and unfortunately it's resulted in us not being able to be together today. But I'm sharing with you my warmest wishes for a full recovery for the Atlanta community, and appreciate our pivot to this virtual platform. So Stop AAPI Hate, our coalition began 4 years ago because of a rise in anti-Asian political rhetoric around the COVID-19 virus and pandemic, and the resulting harassment and violence that we saw. Since then, the rise in geopolitical tensions between the US and China has resulted in an increase in both anti-Asian political rhetoric and policymaking. And the false narratives around national security are now more anti-immigrant in nature, which are resulting in policies like land bans that racially profile innocent people. This week, we released our report, which I have here, From Pain to Power, on the state of anti-AAPI hate, which found that racism may be shifting in some ways from the individual acts of discrimination to, in fact, institutional discrimination and racism in areas such as housing, workplace, education, and we'll talk more about this during our panel discussion. At Stop AAPI Hate, as part of our Stop the Blame campaign, we've been working to build a multi-state coalition to mobilize from the ground up, as well as partner with policymakers on the state and federal levels to fight land ban laws. Sadly, since 2023, there have been 21 bills introduced that discriminate against individuals of Asian descent, and 8 of them have passed. In 2023, we worked with partners in Texas to defeat the alien land ban legislation, SB 147 and others. And we're supporting the ACLU and ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, in their lawsuit to overturn California's alien land law that was passed last year. We are mobilizing with them our communities on the ground and bringing attention to the harms that this law wreaks really on our communities in Florida, in which the Justice Department says they violate the Fair Housing Act and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The good news is that our report shows that the vast majority of AAPIs are primed to take action against racism, and nearly 3 out of 4 adults participated in activities to reduce or resist racism in 2023. So we hope today energizes you to stay involved if you're already fighting with us, and to join us in this fight if you're learning about it today. And to speak more about Georgia's land ban legislation that passed earlier this year, I want to welcome Jennifer Lee, the Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Jennifer?
Hi, Manju. Thank you so much for that intro. My name is Jennifer Lee again, and I am the Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Thank you so much for being here today. And later on, you'll also be hearing from my colleague, Tom Phan, who's a Senior Policy Associate at Advancing Justice Atlanta. So if you're not familiar with our organization, we work statewide, and Advancing Justice is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to protecting the civil rights of our communities, and the communities we focus on are Asian American Pacific Islander communities, as well as Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities here in Georgia, which we know are actually some of the fastest growing communities here in our state. And our vision as an organization is really not only to protect the civil rights that we all deserve and have the right to have living in the United States, but also we envision a place where our communities feel fully empowered to be active in civic life in our home state. So thank you all so much for being here. I am going to turn it over to Tom, and we will go ahead and get started with the program. I did want to note that since we are in this webinar format, please feel free to use the chat, and there's also a Q&A function at the bottom of your panel where you can submit questions for the panelists as well. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Phan. I'm the Senior Policy Associate at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. And if you haven't already, you can scan the QR code that we have to get more information on our panelists. That's in a later section. It also leads to some material that we've prepared, such as a timeline and a fact sheet. And so I just wanted to start off by giving talking about the concept of home, given that the title of the event is Home is Here. And we wanted to start off with an icebreaker that allows you to share what makes a place home for you. And you know, what makes you feel like you belong, what makes you feel like as though you've been excluded. And feel free to share in the chat, and I can kind of kick us off. I can share that a home for me is a place where I feel that I can invest in, that I'm able to build community through schooling, work, or community engagement. What makes me feel at home, what makes me feel like I'm not at home is when I feel unwelcome, or if there are structures that lead me to experience discrimination. I'm actually not from Georgia. I grew up in South Carolina, but I've lived here for the past 2 years, and I've been able to find community through a lot of my advocacy work. But policies like Georgia's alien land laws remind me that people like me, people who look like me and I are not welcome in many parts of the state. And I think that's really unfortunate given the diversity of Georgia and all its immigrant groups who've come to make this place home. So I'd just like to prompt participants to share their thoughts on what makes Georgia home to them, or just the concept of home when they feel that they belong, or times that they felt excluded. Comments have said that feel at home when there's inclusion, acceptance, comfort, and open expression. Home is where I feel safe. I can let my guard down, and I'm free from judgment, discrimination, and harm. Another comment, I feel at home when simply being greeted kindly in public. And home equals where I don't have to look over my shoulder for safety. Another comment, I feel at home when I see diversity and, more importantly, inclusion. Home is where I can find comfort and security, a place of refuge. Home is comfort and acceptance. I feel most at home when I am able to connect and positively interact and connect with a large portion of my local community. Home is where I feel secure and not judged as being different. Home to me is where I can be genuine and feel safe, and where those I love can feel the same. Exclusion to me often feels like being ignored. Anjali from Advancing Justice has joined and shares that home is a place of safety and comfort to be her authentic self. Anna, a member of the community, she's been away from Georgia for a long time for school and has worked recently, returned. Although she's been away for a long time, she feels that like home is where she's established community with people who feel inclusive and familiar. So great comments. Thanks everyone for sharing. So I think it's clear that home is a safe space. Home is where I can feel myself, unapologetic. I feel excluded when I don't see others who may look like me in a space. Home feels like accommodation. Thank you for sharing, folks. So I think I'll get into what the land laws are, but I will say that, some of the ideas, these feelings that we've expressed are of what home is the antithesis of what these land laws kind of seek to achieve by saying who belongs, who doesn't, where they can live, where they can purchase property, at least, and so have you. So I'll appreciate everyone for sharing. I'll talk briefly about the rise of anti-Asian sentiments and policies, but they're not new, right? It's like some of these started with when the first Chinese migrants came to the U.S. and during the gold rush, and were met with the very next year foreign miners tax in 1850. So discriminatory policies continued with the Exclusion Act and other policies in the 20th century, such as the Alien Land Laws of California, where that targeted people of Japanese descent. And that's on our timeline as well. If you look at our timeline, we have certain significant moments throughout Asian American history, both in terms of anti-Asian policies and events, as well as how communities have responded and certain wins that we've achieved through the courts, through organizing. So that's there for your reference. I will point your attention to the two alien land laws of California in the early 1900s that were a few years later deemed unconstitutional by the California Supreme Court. And these laws would, excuse me, and yet their legacies have continued to this day with these new alien land laws. And over the past 2 years, Georgia's legislators introduced 4 anti-Asian land laws until it passed one in SB 420. Georgia is one of over 30 states that have introduced anti-alien land laws in recent years. And what SB 420 does is it prohibits the purchase or lease of land by certain foreign nationals from China, Hong Kong, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. And you can look at the fact sheet for more information. You can see a map on the fact sheet of some impacted areas. Advancing Justice have identified 16 military installations that would prohibit the purchase or lease of land within 10 miles of those military installations, airport or military bases throughout Georgia. And there is a residential exception, but it applies. It also applies to agricultural land and unzoned land throughout the state. Also, foreign businesses are also restricted. This includes small businesses, owners, and other investors. And the final version of SB 420 was narrowed a bit to target foreign agents, but given this definition, this could also apply to foreign students, diplomats, and other people with certain visas. Violations of this bill can result in a $15,000 fine and 1 to 2 years in prison. So beyond those are explicitly targeted by these legislation, it could also exacerbate discrimination against people for their perceived nationality. So if you're a US born citizen of, say, Vietnamese descent, it's possible that you could also be discriminated against because of this law. Because oftentimes people don't differentiate people's ethnicities, people's nationalities, and no one should be indiscriminately targeted as a quote unquote foreign agent. So we hope that today's event will do a few things. Make sure that you're aware of what this law is and that some of you take action to combat it, and that you are not fearful, which is what the law can do to people, and help people feel empowered as a community to face these issues and as others arise as well. And with that, I think we're ready to start the panel. I'll pass it back to Manju to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. Hello again. It gives me a great honor and privilege to introduce to you all our esteemed panelists for today. And so I'm going to go in the order of how they will be answering my questions. I'm going to first start with Professor Chris Suh. He's an associate professor of history at Emory University, where he teaches Asian American history and U.S. Asian relations. Next, we have Angela Hsu, who's an attorney specializing in commercial real estate and is former president of GAPABA, which is the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association. After that, we have Representative Sam Park, who is state representative in the Georgia legislature, representing House District 107. And last but not least, we have Jamal Abdi, who is president of the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, Iranian Americans, as folks may know, have also been a target in many state land bans, including Georgia's SB 420. You can read more about our panelists in the About the Panelists section of the link tree, which is included in the chat. So we're going to start first, Chris, with you. I want to ask why we're seeing a return of these discriminatory and anti-Asian laws, not only in Georgia, but across the country. And if you can discuss with us really some of the historical context around anti-Asian scapegoating, as well as what's happening currently and the tensions with the Chinese government.
Thank you so much, Manju, for that question. And thank you, everybody, for having me here. I'm going to spend no more than 4 or 5 minutes kind of going over the history of alien land acts from roughly 1850s to 1950s to get you not only the historical context, but also a sense of what exactly is at stake here when we talk about alien lands acts. And what's interesting about these laws that prevent or prohibit non-US born Asian Americans from purchasing real estate actually goes back to as early as 1859. And in the case of Oregon, they didn't even need to actually pass an act like this. It's in the state constitution. In other words, when the state of Oregon was founded, it actually said, and it actually used a racial epithet here, quotes, no Chinaman can hold any real estate, etc. So in some cases, from the very beginning of life, some states in the United States, especially on the West Coast, decided that their land was going to be protecting, quote unquote, protecting basically their own residents from what they perceived to be foreign threats. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. But broadly speaking, the what we think about as alien lands acts are actually acts passed by state legislature to take an action at the state level, not at the federal level, to prohibit first-generation Asian immigrants. And the most infamous one that is also probably most useful for us to talk about today is the Alien Land Law, and that was passed in 1913. And its primary targets were Japanese immigrants, even though if you read the law, it actually applies broadly to all Asian immigrants. Next slide, please. And the reason for that are double. One actually seems pretty obvious, which is that when this land law is passed in 1913, the most populous group of Asian Americans in the U.S. are Japanese. Before that, it was Chinese, Japanese, and then nowadays it's South Asian. But one of the things that to kind of think about is that when these land laws are argued for by nativist politicians, oftentimes they will target the most populous group of Asian Americans, and it's something to kind of keep in mind that just because in 1913 it targeted Japanese Americans, that it didn't affect other Asian Americans. It's just that oftentimes we have to kind of think about what exactly is the law that is being passed, even though the arguments for passing these laws might be targeting specific people. If you go to the next slide, you'll actually learn something very interesting that is quite different from today, which is that in 1913, because of U.S.-Japan relations at this time, more specifically because U.S.-Japan relations was cordial, not hostile, the U.S. federal government, in fact, the Secretary of State, tries really hard to prohibit or prevent the governor of California from signing his bill. So imagine that the Biden administration sends Secretary of State Tony Blinken to Atlanta and says, Governor Kemp, please do not sign this to law. This is actually going to hurt our relationship with U.S., with China, with Iran, Russia, North Korea, etc. That is basically what Secretary of State William James Bryan had to do at the time. And this changes, obviously, as we go into the 1930s and 40s. If you go to the next slide, please. Because as we know from history, U.S.-Japan relations sours over several decades. And you're going to actually see something in this cartoon that is going to be resonating with the way that, especially Chinese immigrants, but I guess immigrants from countries that are considered rivals on the international stage are considered. So, for example, in 1910s, during World War I, the United States actually started using fear-mongering tactics to say that Japanese farmers were trying to own land, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico, were actually in reality, military officials who were under disguise. In other words, instead of thinking about immigrants as people who are trying to participate in the U.S. economy and the U.S. democracy, they really thought about them as what is now called foreign agents, people who are going to infiltrate the United States and monopolize U.S. food supply, maybe even create military bases, etc. And if we go to the next slide, we're going to actually see is really a naked form of racism. In that by the time we get to 1920s, you have sitting U.S. senators running for re-election under the slogan "Keep California White." This is actually a poster from re-election campaign of James D. Phelan, who was a Democrat. And the key term that was used a lot at this time was this idea that Japanese immigrants were part of Japan's strategy of silent invasion, meaning that instead of using its military to invade another country, they're using its immigrants as people who can easily be turned into a foreign agent / military threats. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to just very briefly talk about how people fought back. And one of the most common ways that these laws are challenged, of course, is going to the courts. And during the 20s, 1930s, there were really largely three groups that were collaborating to challenge these acts. First, obviously, are the immigrant organizations, what would be equivalent to Advancing Justice and AAPI Equity Alliance at the time, although at the time in the 1920s, Pan-Asianism was not yet a thing. So you have all these Japanese Society of America who, members were, by lawyers. But the other two partnership is actually really interesting because large landowners are really, really, really invested in trying to defeat these laws. And as you might actually can be able to tell from this Supreme Court case, Porterfield versus Webb, notice that it's actually there's no Asian name here. There's no Asian person challenging the state of California. It's actually Porterfield, who's a white landowner, who's saying that actually racism is bad for business, that it's actually preventing landowners from profiting from selling their land to immigrants who, from their perspective, are not foreign agents. And then there are also missionaries, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it has changed a lot, but these are people who are engaged in missions abroad, especially in places like Japan, where they're really concerned that what happens in the United States is going to negatively impact their work in Japan. And very final slide, and I noticed that one of the guests put this in the chat today. So while alien land laws, including the ones that have been passed recently in the U.S. South, mostly target non-U.S. born Asian immigrants, particularly from countries that are seen as quote unquote threats. By the time we get to World War II, actually, even U.S.-born Asian immigrants, more specifically Japanese immigrants, are denied their rights to their lands, even though this was not the case through the first 4 decades of the 20th century. And it is only after World War II, after the so-called internment or incarceration of Japanese Americans is over, that Asian Americans are able to challenge these on the grounds of 14th Amendment rights. And by the time we get to 1952, these alien land acts are pretty much over. Now, why do they return? Part of it is that there is oftentimes this way in which that state governments, state legislators want to in some ways look tough against quote unquote a foreign adversary, in part because they're actually in conflict with the federal government. So think about which states are currently have been trying really hard to, in other words, kind of embarrass the federal government with these laws and create tensions. It's mostly going to be the Republican-controlled state legislatures. The other part to think about in terms of present-day context, and I hope that we can revisit this, is that most of these land laws are most impactful in that they are used as fear-mongering tactics at the state level to get voters to think twice about the fact that, let's say, an Asian person is moving next door, or an Asian person is making a purchase that is in the news of agricultural lands. You might have noticed that in many of the justifications of the current alien land laws, the state legislators have been using national security as an excuse to justify this, that they are infiltrating U.S. Economy, monopolizing food source, and this is actually something that used to be also the case in the early 20th century. And unfortunately, it does often work really well, this tactic, when there is a geopolitical tension between the United States and some Asian country. And in the cases that I've shown today, it was really just Japan. And nowadays, obviously, it's just China. But unfortunately, I will say that as United States relationship with different Asian countries change, whether it be with India, South Korea, Vietnam, etc., it's going to be something to keep an eye on because, basically, there is a tendency, there's a pattern to change targets of discrimination as well as violence. So I'll stop my remarks here for now, and then we'll come back to any questions that might rise from my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Next, we want to move to Angela. And Angela, my question for you is, what are some of the key provisions of SB 420, and how could it impact individuals and communities? And if you can touch a bit on fair housing and how that also works to protect communities.
Thank you, Manju, and thank you all the panelists, all the great work that you do. I'm really honored to be part of this. So in looking at the slide, I think that one of the elements here that I think is underappreciated is that, so I think for a lot of Americans, you either have US citizens or green card holders or illegal, undocumented. And there's a whole class of people who are here working legally or studying here legally, such as H-1B professionals, F students, J-class professionals, and asylum seekers. So all those people would kind of fall into what would be considered a non-resident alien. So all those folks. And also, if you look at the non-resident aliens, so that, there's the obvious, which is a company that's deemed, that's based in one of these countries. I think that's a little obvious. But in real estate and in business in general, there are a lot of passive ownership vehicles of, 25% or more, where there are companies that are based abroad that have a non-controlling passive ownership in a lot of different things. So that's very common in real estate. It's very common in business in general. All those are kind of swept into the prohibitions of this law. Also, I want to point out kind of the agents of foreign governments provision is like acts in the capacity or under the direction or control, supervisor, finance directly or indirectly by one of these foreign governments. How would you ever figure that out? So this law is designed to kind of penalize, for example, brokers. Like if you're a broker, you can't represent a buyer or a seller in a transaction involving one of these. And the agent of foreign government piece, there's no way for them to diligence that. The other thing is that it could be the possessory interest part could be owning or leasing. The other thing I want to point out is the two types of real estate we don't want the non-resident aliens in Georgia to own or lease are agricultural land. Well, it's about a third of the real estate that sits in Georgia is agricultural land. I also want to point out that, you know, oftentimes land that is really intended to be something else productively can be classified as agricultural land for tax savings for a period. So some of that will never be farmed, but it's technically agricultural land for a time until it becomes a warehouse or something else. The 10-mile radius of military base, I think the next slide should be that map. Those are the military bases. I'm not even completely sure in my research where the military air bases are, but those are the military bases. They're all over Georgia. So, I mean, I think between all the agricultural land and then all the bases, the 10 miles from the bases, that's most of Georgia. So what this law really signals is that if you are a non-resident alien, or if you're a company with some kind of passive ownership, in particular from China, from Chinese companies, you really can't be owning real estate or really leasing real estate in the state of Georgia. So this slide is really about like what the penalties are, fines and prison, and you know, you can be in prison. And I think that the folks that I think are most impacted by this are brokers. I think brokers are a large class of people that I think are going to be really concerned about this, because again, like they will have trouble figuring out who's covered. And there's so much real estate in the state of Georgia that is impacted. So how do they even figure out? And what's, you know, what could happen is that if they see anybody with, you know, with an Asian face, they're going to be a little bit concerned about this. The other really terrible penalty here is that if there is a conveyance that's done, that conveyance could be voided, and the parties that are impacted, you know, could lose all their value. They can't even make a claim. So if you are one of these people buying property or leasing property, you really could just lose that, and you don't get any compensation for that. I think even for groups or individuals that had their interests before the passage of this law, they have a few years in some cases to divest, or they will just lose their interest. I think in terms of the fair housing, you know, piece, that theoretically there's some minimal impact because residences are carved out of this. So, you know, and I'm sure Representative Park can speak more to exactly what the debate was on the floor, but primary residences are carved out. Secondary residences are not. So if you have a vacation home or something like that, as a non-resident alien, you would be impacted. And we'll get to the fact patterns later, and you know.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. So next question is for you, Representative Park. What was included in the earlier version of the bill, and how did it change?
Sure.
And a related question is really about enforcement of this bill. So if you could answer all of those together.
Sure. So, good morning, everyone. Apologies, I'm a little under the weather, so my voice is a bit scratchy. So regarding these alien land law bills, I'll provide some legislative history and context. Essentially, we were debating these bills in the state of Georgia for the past 2 years. In 2023, the state Senate passed off their floor essentially a bill that was almost identical to the Florida version of the alien land law that's currently been enjoined in part, at least as to one or two of the plaintiffs. we were successful in stopping that bill in 2023, even though it passed a House committee as well as a Senate floor. 3 times it came up, and 3 times I was able to, at least pause it in the House Rules Committee last year. This year, especially this year being an election year, they doubled down. So they introduced, I think, 2 different versions of a bill that we were successful in defeating last year, including HB 1093. And thankfully, with a lot of conversations with members of the AAPI caucus and Republicans who really wanted this, we were able to narrow down and mitigate some of the harm that we saw. So initially, the bill was facially discriminatory in violation of the Fair Housing Act. It applied broadly to any non-resident alien. And we were, after multiple conversations, and one facilitated by Representative Michelle Au, with our agricultural commissioner, who was a big supporter of this initiative, was able to narrow that provision down, or its application, only to those considered an agent of a foreign government. As of course Angela noted, it's an open question as to how you determine that from a matter of enforcement. 2, we were able to further narrow the scope of its applicability from a 25-mile radius to 10 miles. Those were, I think, the 2 primary areas that we were able to address. But initially, we had identified 4 legal issues. One, of course, was that it was facially discriminatory, though it seems like that issue still remains when it comes to secondary properties, as Angela mentioned. We worked very closely with the Georgia Realtors Association to ensure that it wouldn't automatically trigger a lawsuit similar to the Florida bill, again, with the understanding that as members of the minority party, our first obligation is to stop harm, mitigate harm where we can. Excuse me. So we were able to, in part, address the facially discriminatory aspect. There were also constitutional challenges. One, there was a clear concern regarding the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, along with due process concerns, particularly when it comes to disinvestment of the property. Some of the attorneys that we talked to said that those concerns were, again, in part addressed by further narrowing the bill so that it would only apply to foreign agents of an adversarial country. Though, of course, that kind of remains an open question. The last and the 4th legal issue that we identified with this bill was that this is an issue that is ultimately preempted by federal law, by existing federal law that exists. Some additional context I think that is important regarding this debate is throughout the past 2 years, all we've heard from the Republican sponsors of this issue was that this is about China, right? This is and joking and in asides, Republicans would say, oh, clearly y'all must be agents, foreign agents of the Chinese government if y'all were trying to stop this bill from becoming law, right? And so it was a very challenging and difficult environment, one, to protect Asian Americans from discriminatory laws like this, or laws like this that would cause harm or increase the risk of discrimination. And so it's certainly very, very grateful of the good work of Asian Americans advancing justice. I think Tom was down at the Capitol every single day trying to, build a coalition to slow this bill down. But again, I think as Manju or as Chris had said earlier, it is this fear-mongering tactic is a very effective electioneering approach, in which ultimately there were a few Democrats who ended up voting for this bill, in part because, they were very much concerned that agricultural land in Georgia was under siege, as described by some of these Republican champions of this piece of legislation, even though when asked, can you show me the data? Can you show me information? Can you show me reports? It was nothing but rhetoric. And so, with where we are right now, this bill can be enforced by any legal counsel, by a county commission, by the attorney general, because there's a felony as a part of this piece of legislation for anybody who intentionally violates its provisions. Of course, I would assume that any district attorney would also be able to file suit. But the last piece I would add is, this wasn't the only piece of legislation debated in Georgia that was focused on the Red Scare, or trying to drive a wedge between communities of color, saying Asian Americans or anybody who looks Chinese is trying to come in and take over. We saw two other pieces of legislation, one that would require additional reporting for any donations made to our universities from, again, this list of adversarial countries. Another piece of legislation that interestingly was vetoed by Governor Kemp this year, SB 368, would prevent foreign nationals from making political contributions. That passed with bipartisan support. And the reason Governor Kemp vetoed this bill, SB 368, is essentially because it imposes additional state level registration requirements on agents and foreign principals that already exist in federal law. And essentially he is saying, he's vetoing SB 368 because it's preempted by federal law, which is the exact same reason why he should have vetoed SB 420, because this is an issue that, again, is not just discriminatory, not just increases the risk of discrimination of Asian Americans who call Georgia home, but is, unconstitutional, that it's preempted by federal law.
Thanks so much, Representative Park. Really appreciate that. The next question is for you, Jamal, which is, sadly, we know that it's not only Chinese communities that are impacted. Can you explain to us how Iranian American communities are being affected by these alien land laws?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And so, yeah, if you're wondering why are Iranian Americans involved in this fight and supporting and helping with these efforts to try to stop these bills, whether in Georgia or other state capitals around the country, or in the U.S. Congress, where one of these measures, a small piece of it, actually did pass the House, I think it was last week. And that's because, first of all, I think, any of us who are immigrant communities who could potentially be exposed to these sorts of discriminatory measures do need to stand up, no matter what community is being targeted. Discrimination never stops, and it's not targeted. It is a broad measure. And so I think that, there have been several issues like this where, politicians, lawmakers have grouped together certain immigrant communities and said they are a threat, they're scary, they are, potentially foreign agents, all of this stuff. And, for my organization, it's really important that we be involved in the fight against those, when it's our community that's being targeted, but also when it's other communities being targeted, because you could be next. And that's what we have found, is that these measures never stop. This is the slippery slope that we're talking about. So most of these measures, including the Georgia measure, include Iranians in the list of nationals who are targeted. But I should say, most of the laws that pass do eventually specify foreign nationals and do at least a little bit to protect citizens of the United States, but they're not always so specific. And I think that one of the points of this work is this notion of intended ambiguity. So for Iranian Americans, the reason that it's the, geopolitical tensions that lump us into, the groups of, targeted immigrant communities and minority communities. But, Iran is the most sanctioned country on earth. And as a result, there is significant blowback for Iranian Americans, Iranians in the diaspora, Iranians who are here as permanent residents or on visas. And that takes that happens with laws like this. It also happens with issues like banking discrimination or sanctions related discrimination, where, for example, not far from here in Atlanta 10 years ago, there was actually an issue where Apple stores were preventing Iranian Americans from buying products because the way that sanctions are enforced, it lends itself to sort of vigilantism. And you had Apple Store employees who heard people speaking Persian and said, "Oh, what language are you speaking?" So immediately you're speaking a certain language and you're profiled by somebody who thinks that they need to uphold the law that says you can't sell, iPhones to Iran because of sanctions. Then when the people said, "Oh, we're speaking Persian, we're Iranian American," then they're immediately asked, "Oh, are you planning to travel to Iran?" Because that would then be a sanctions violation. So in this mundane situation of just wanting to buy a phone or a computer or whatever, you are suddenly being questioned by, an employee of the store, a retail employee, about what language you're speaking, where you're from, your travel plans. And it's this invasion of your privacy, but also invasion of this concept that we're talking about here, about feeling like you're home, about this being your home, about you being free to do these things. And so we have seen all kinds of laws and regulations put into place, particularly over the past 10, 15 years, that are presented as, well, we're just targeting the bad actors, we're just targeting, government officials or this or that. But there is this ambiguity, and I think it's an intentional ambiguity. And I talk about kind of that concept as a matter of sanctions law and sort of national security law. But really what it says is, we don't want to be so specific as to actually only narrowly target the bad actors. We want there to be enough ambiguity that there's going to be sort of this environment of people, institutions, banks, businesses erring on the side of discriminating on the basis of other cues: how you look, what language you speak, your name, how you present, all these other things, to cast a much wider net of preventing people from being able to access certain services or goods or things like that. And so that is just legalized discrimination. It's actually the use of discrimination in order to effectuate a policy that is very broad and to talk about it in a targeted way. But I also think that the motivation here, which has already been alluded to, is that these are not backed up by any sort of evidence or data or indications that they make us safer. They are, however, really effective tools to mobilize a certain constituency, a certain voter. And so as Iranian Americans teaming up with other targeted communities, my hope is, this needs to be a political liability. This cannot be something that people run and win on. This needs to be something that if you talk about, you're going to proudly ban people based on where their national origin is, or basically legalize the prospect of vast profiling on racial or national origin matters. That needs to be a liability. And so our communities need to be able to work together to make that a liability and create a cost, so that we are not just political tools that get beaten up by politicians who want to show how tough they are and want to play into bigotry and don't really care about how that has a practical impact on the lives of Americans and people who are here legally and who have the same rights as the rest of us, or should have the same rights as the rest of us.
Thanks so much, Jamal. That actually is a wonderful segue to the next question which is for Chris, and I think we have time for one question per panelist. As was put in the chat, please do add your questions, audience members, and we will get to those after the ones that I have. So Chris, you spoke first about ways in which our communities were targeted in the 1900s and earlier. What are some of the lessons from our rich history about how Asian Americans have fought back, including some of the recent examples in Florida and Texas? As our report, which I mentioned, talks about, is that resistance to racism. And so if you could share a little bit about what we've done in the past, both the distant past as well as the recent past.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Very briefly, in terms of the distant past, there's a reason why I highlighted in one of the slides some of the allies of Asian Americans who ended up challenging these Alien Land Acts. And first was, and then this continues the case, and Angela actually pointed to this as well in her presentation. There are people who are going to lose a lot of money from these bills being passed and being enforced. In other words, whether it be sellers of real estate, brokers of real estate. And in fact, this was something that I noticed that was very interesting about the case in Texas, where the Alien Land Bill actually died without a vote after a lot of protests. And one of the ways that Asian American advocacy groups worked with legislative members of state legislature as well as members of real estate associations was that there was simply too much money to be made from actually allowing different people from the listed countries from engaging in real estate transactions. So as uninspiring as that might sound, sometimes it is actually good to remind the politicians who are fear mongering that, well, actually, what you're saying and what you're doing is going to be bad for our state and bad for our country. In fact, and as it was pointed out several times, if you start looking at the data, there's actually very little, for example, evidence that China is trying to monopolize agricultural sector. In fact, U.S. Department of Agriculture, as it should, does a survey of which countries own the most amount of land in the U.S. and it's almost always like Canada, France, Germany, etc. And I want to actually sort of give you another example of how we might actually think about combating aside from taking to court is that, and this again was interesting. I was able to read the minutes of the state senate in Texas when this bill was being argued. So the Republican sponsor of the Alien Land Bill there tried to deflect arguments saying that this was a racist bill by saying two things, and she actually put it, and it's really interesting. She said it so explicitly. She said, because Russia is actually part of this list of people, of people who can't buy land in Texas, and because Russians, and I'm quoting her, are blue-eyed and blonde-haired, this is quote unquote not racism, which I thought was an interesting way to kind of try to deflect that. Upon being pressed even further, the Republican sponsor also start to cite and very specifically start to say, well, actually, there's a reason why my bill does not target Indian Americans because, Indian Americans are in India is not a geopolitical adversary of the United States, and in fact, she said that she represents a large number of Indian Americans in the U.S. So she tries actually to basically, derive a wedge between one group of Asian Americans versus other. Now, what was interesting, it actually didn't work. And unfortunately, it died in the state legislature and was never implemented. And the lesson that we can actually learn from that is that it does take at least two things. One is like coalition politics. Sometimes it's actually with unexpected, maybe expected partners, like people who are gonna make money off these transactions. The other part is reminding ourselves that we have to always think, and as Jamal pointed out earlier, that the targets of discrimination and violence change, every a couple of years. Only, 20 years ago, it was mainly targeting, especially after 9/11, mostly South Asian and Muslim and Middle Eastern Americans. Now it's changing to, China and anybody who looks Chinese. In the case of Florida, it was slightly different, but what was somewhat encouraging is that even though the alien land bill was passed and signed by the governor, ACLU in coordination with Chinese American Legal Defense Alliance were able to take the case to court, and at least for now was able to get a temporary injunction, basically temporarily prevent Florida from enforcing the law. We'll see what happens next, but there are ways in which that we can actually use both the courts as well as coalition politics to combat these hateful acts, and I think those are the lessons that we should keep in mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Angela, I want to turn back to you. How will SB 420 make it more difficult for Asian Americans and other communities of color to purchase or rent land, homes and businesses? And I know you have a few fact patterns to share with us.
Yeah, thank you. So, I thought these fact patterns would be an interesting way to kind of see a real application of, of the law. And so the first fact pattern I have is, and I will also get to one of the audience questions here too. Professor Lee has an H-1B. That's one of those, he's not a permanent resident. He's legally here working as a professional, and he's not a citizen. So he works at Georgia Tech, which there are a lot of H-1B professors that work at Georgia Tech. In data science. So right before summer, his mother falls ill. He's in China with her for 2 months. And while he's in China, he picks up some consulting work from, there are a lot of Chinese government entities. So their industry has a lot of government investment. And before summer break, he bought some land up in Oconee where he was going to do a summer cottage, and the property is zoned agricultural. So this is one of those instances in which he could actually lose his property. And I want to address the audience question is, if the foreign entity or individual is not representing foreign government, will they be restricted? Technically, no. But if you look at the definition of agent of foreign government, it's acts in the capacity of or the direction of control, supervise, finance directly or indirectly. So in this instance, I think Professor Lee, because he took on a side consulting thing that from a entity that is, quasi-government control, that would really, he would be swept up in it. Let's go to the second fact pattern. I think so. This is an agricultural company. It's the largest agricultural company operating in China. They're fully financed by the Chinese government. They come to Georgia and they lease 1,000 acres of agricultural land, but they're going to use a little bit of it for some research. Is this prohibited? And here's the crazy thing. Here's where you really can see the absurdity of this statute is this is an exception. So you could have the biggest agricultural company in China come here, and as long as they're doing a lease. Now, what leases in my industry, a lease can be 1 year, it could be 5 years, it could be 100 years. Okay, which a 100-year lease or 50-year lease is the equivalent of owning. But it's really easy for this giant agricultural company to come in and control 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, whatever it is. Okay, this is an exception that was carved out of the statute. So you really poor Professor Lee would be swept up, would lose his land, but this company could come in here and do this. So this really, I think, shows you that this statute is a lot of political theater, is the best way I can put it. Is, to some of the comments that Professor Suh and Representative Park said, like, there's just a lot of fear mongering and, kind of political theater. Oh, we're anti-China. That's our adversary. Next fact pattern. So this is Mr. Momeni, who's a citizen of the United States, and he's of Persian descent. He owns a wholesale rug business that's very, very successful. He's been in the United States for generations, his family has, but there's, 25% of the interest is owned by rug suppliers overseas in one of the Caribbean countries. He owns warehouse space near Dobbins, which you could. It's very easy to find land in these areas for this purpose. So this would be a prohibited. Mr. Momeni would be in a position where he would either have to divest of the 25% interest, insist that those people, get rid of their interest, buy them out, or sell his property. And so I think that what I'm trying to show with some of these examples of, when you kind of plug them through the mechanism of the statute, how silly this stuff becomes. And that it really, and the problem is that, it doesn't protect Americans. It doesn't protect our food supply. Our food supply was never under threat. What it does, in my opinion, is that it destroys value. Just like all the other examples of the alien land laws that, Professor Suh had put in front of us. These are statutes, and you can see in Texas that people realize that it destroys value for us, that it keeps capital from coming into this state, meaningful capital that would be productive, but instead we're going to pivot this way because we want to buy votes this way. I don't think that, I really believe that that this maybe will be in limited enforcement because it's so hard to enforce, and it's so, and I don't think that people that push this law really made it super capable of being enforced. But it's just one of those things where it's another way to other our community, to make people who look like us somehow seen as something different in the US. And unfortunately, even though the law technically doesn't impact citizens or residents, it sweeps us in because people like us can be discriminated against because someone is saying, well, look, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to, go to jail or whatever. I don't want to be subject to a fine.
Thanks so much, Angela. And I think it's a really good reminder, the chilling effect that it can have for so many in our communities. We have a few more minutes, and I have just two last questions, one for Sam and one for Jamal. Sam, the question for you is, are these land laws a precursor to other harmful legislation? And what does the legislature need from the community to defeat these laws that are so harmful?
Yeah, so I think most definitely this could be a precursor to additional legislation that attacks immigrant communities, more broadly speaking than just Asian American. This year we also saw incredibly dangerous legislation targeted toward the Hispanic Latino community in Georgia being enacted, especially after the murder of Lake and Riley, as horrific as that was, which was also unfortunately politicized. It's interesting in which, you'll hear from folks like Governor Kemp of, now is not the time to talk about politics or policy after a school shooting. And yet at the same time, it's all politics and policy, when it comes to targeting immigrant communities after, a horrific incident occurs in another instance. I think as Professor Suh mentioned, looking back at our history is incredibly important to help navigate this very dangerous period of time, because I think we are going through a nativist, we're seeing a rise of nativist xenophobic sentiment across the country, certainly in light of a lot of the geopolitical tensions and increasing concerns across the board. The best way, I think, for us to protect ourselves is continue in light of the likelihood that we will continue to see threats and additional legislation that attacks Asian Americans or other immigrant communities is to use our political power. It is very, very clear that these attacks and these threats are coming from one political party. Unfortunately, that is the Republican Party today, as it's been transformed and taken over by Trump and this far-right MAGA faction. But that's where it continues to emanate from. And it's not just within a few specific states. It very much seems like a comprehensive strategy. We have this China initiative at the federal level that's continued to come up over the past few years. And again, as previously mentioned, more than 30 states have now introduced some version of this political theater, as Attorney Xu very clearly highlighted, and that it creates a clear exception for what it says that it's trying to address, which is Chinese companies coming in to experiment on agricultural products. And so now is really the time in which we need to use our political power, certainly this election cycle, as Jamal said, to make clear that this is politically unviable. Asian Americans are the fastest growing, ethnic voting bloc in America. Now is a time in which we can really step up, push back, and continue to work in coalition to say this is not the direction in which we want our country to move toward.
Thanks so much. And then the last question I have very quickly for Jamal, and then we'll take the 2 questions that are in the Q&A. Jamal, why should non-Chinese folks care about these laws? Why should South Asians care about these laws? You mentioned it a little bit in your previous answer, but if you could really sort of elucidate for us why others in the community should be concerned.
So I think what's important is that this is a problem. If people say, okay, I'm not a targeted community, and so why should I care about this? And you get into sort of this transactional approach to civil rights and to your safety versus a principled approach. So if it's transactional, by the time you have been discriminated against, by the time you try to make a real estate purchase and you're finding that the price is being driven up because of uncertainty about your national origin or other things, or you're unable to actually buy land, by then it's too late. By then, the principle of legalizing this discrimination against certain immigrants on the basis of their national origin or other factors has already become law, has already become part of the infrastructure that can now be deployed against you. And for me, I'm always reminded of, around this time during the end of the Obama administration, there was, in response to attacks by ISIS, there was this push in Congress to impose visa restrictions on certain communities, and that included on Iranians, and particularly Iranians in Europe and the diaspora, which is ironic given that if you actually follow the geopolitics, ISIS and Iran are not friends. They were in war with one another. They attack one another. And yet Iran is lumped in with the group. And a lot of people said, okay, well, that's too bad, but it's not going to impact me. It just impacts, Iranians in Europe now have to go through extra steps to try to travel to the United States. There's some questions about dual nationality. Maybe it could impact me, but the lawmakers are saying it doesn't, so I'm okay. And then that law got signed into law. Democrats ended up supporting it because they said, well, it'll be worse if we don't support this because there's a push to ban all refugees. And so we're going to accept these limited compromises on the basis of dual nationality and things like that. Well, that then became the basis for Donald Trump's Muslim ban. So refugees all did get banned. And meanwhile, for our community, I actually had people say to me, oh, well, Muslim ban, that doesn't sound great, but I'm not Muslim, so it's all good. My family's not Muslim, so we're good. Well, the law didn't say we're going to target you and ask you questions, and for us to then say, well, it's okay to ban people on the basis of their religion. Well, guess what? It came for us. It came for all of us. The discrimination doesn't discriminate on the basis of these small things. So I think that, you know, you want to stop this when the canary in the coal mine tells you it's time to stop it, and not wait until it's too late and it's already come for you. And that's why everybody who theoretically could be impacted by this, if you just switch the names of the countries in the law, needs to step up and acknowledge this is an attack on a principle, a fundamental principle that keeps us safe. And if we sacrifice that for another community, it is going to come for our community.
That is exactly right. Thank you so much, Jamal. And I know we had a few questions in the Q&A, and some of those have been answered, but I do want to ask them to give a chance for all of our panelists. And if we can bring them all up here, that is the screen, put our 4 panelists on the screen. That first question was about successful strategies and actions to defeat narratives that describe our communities as foreign or alien. So I will start with perhaps Chris on this one, and then anybody else who wants to answer. I saw that Angela also answered in the Q&A. Chris, do you want to take that first?
Yes, and then I'll be somewhat brief. I was actually typing the answer, and then I realized it's probably faster for me to answer. So thank you so much for that question, Anna. Unfortunately, when we look at history, there is a tendency by even among Asian Americans to feel that just because the target is in somebody else's back, that they are safe. And I think that if there is something to learn from history, is that there is this rotating target that the United States has, and oftentimes is on the target of people who are seen as quote unquote foreign, whether they be Asian, East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, etc. And I think that it'll be important for people to start thinking about, like, just because we're not the targets now doesn't mean we won't be. And in fact, if you look at history, chances are you were a target, for example, in the past, and think about the commonality across time in terms of experience. The other part is that in terms of, successful strategy and actions, this is somewhat of an aspirational answer, but I think it would be really nice to, and actually Representative Sam Park already kind of mentioned this. We use political power to push back and combat some of the fear-mongering tactics, because oftentimes these accusations of quote unquote foreign agents infiltrating the United States to do things by trying to buy a summer home by a lake. These are things that really need to be fact checked. I think that the more the voters are willing to look up just literally data that's available when they Google, for example, like Canada owns so much land in the United States, and yet there isn't the same kind of alarm towards, let's say, I don't know, who looks Canadian, whatever that might mean. So there is definitely a way in which that I think that people can be more politically engaged, and I think political engagement in general would be a really good starting point here.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in real quick and answer that. I mean, the term Asian American is a political term, primarily to bring together different Asian American ethnic groups to build political power. I think running for office, right, is a critically important way, especially in the Deep South, to demonstrate that we are just as American, no matter if we're here for 1 generation, 5 generations, or 10 generations. That this is our home. And I would also say, especially because I think there was an interesting hypothetical in the chat, or not a hypothetical, but a situation with from Crystal about her dad being a hardcore Republican for 30 years and a Trump supporter. Only a few years ago, we saw a spike in Asian American hate and discrimination because folks like Trump use terms like Kung flu, like the China virus, in which that discrimination was indiscriminate. No one could tell the difference between Korean, Chinese, Japanese, or any of these other East Asian or even South Asian countries apart. But what we saw from that rhetoric focused on, China was, older Asian Americans, older Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans getting beat in the street. Right? We cannot forget that, a threat against one of our communities truly is a threat against all of our communities. But the hope has to remain with the power of the people, right? This is such a critically important election where we can really, truly turn the page from this sort of politics of fear and division, in which, in Georgia, as an example, we've seen the power of Asian Americans in turnout in historic numbers to help turn the page, which again, hopefully we'll see this November as well.
Yeah, I think
Great.
that's a great point, Sam. But the point that I didn't make in the response is we got to vote. As a community, we have to vote. We will not be taken seriously as Americans if we're not voting. And that's historically been a huge problem for our community. But since we turned out in recent elections in Georgia, we're a purple state now, but we have to get out and be heard.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end our conversation today. The election is just a few days away. In fact, some states it's already possible to engage in early voting. So I want to encourage folks that are in Georgia, but also many, those of us outside of Georgia, this is an opportunity to make your voice heard. And so I want to just thank all of you for joining us today in this very important conversation, and especially our panelists, Chris, Angela, Sam, and Jamal, for sharing your wisdom with us. It's been really an insightful conversation. I've learned so much. And I know that and hope that it's activated those of you who've joined us to get involved, be part of that fight. I also want to thank members of our Stop AAPI Hate team alongside Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta for hosting this. And really for all of your work in Georgia, which has been so, so critical, not only on this issue, but so many others that really do. I think your work has been pivotal to advancing justice, as your name indicates. So really appreciate everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and please do stay safe. I'm going to turn it over to Tong for some final remarks.
Thanks, Manchu. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your expertise and insight today. As Sam alluded to, this is something that we've been working on for the past 2 years with many partners. We had a ethnically diverse coalition of partners from GLAR to ARIA, AAAF, Georgia API Hub, and many others who signed our online petition form that, as Sam can attest to, Congress, the House and Senate General Assembly received a lot of emails about this issue, and I think that really helped stem the tide a bit and narrow the bill just enough for it to hopefully make less of an impact. But I'd like to reiterate some of the points that were made and offer a few and make a few asks as well. I think to address questions about, well, if this impact me, or I'm not on the list, or I have a U.S. citizenship. I think Jamal made a really good point of defending principles that protect us all. And we just can't wait for it to come for someone else, or have our advocacy be transactional or kind of on a case-by-case basis, when really it's the principle of inclusion that we're trying to protect. We'd like to ask you to share this information with other community members. We'll look into having the fact sheet translated, as Crystal asked, so that others would kind of receive this message and have people talking to their lawmakers about their displeasure with this, their concerns, and possibly even if they're impacted. I think Angela mentioned how the enforceability of this legislation is kind of unclear, but its impact could be one that dissuades people from purchasing land or doing certain things. So we certainly hope that that doesn't happen, and so we really want to remind people that you do have rights, and there's protections from discrimination in the 14th Amendment. And even with the fair housing piece, agricultural land can also have a home on it, so it's mixed use. And so in that case, that's unclear if it's agricultural land, therefore a non-resident alien can't purchase it, or it has a home on it, even though it's agricultural land, there's a residential exception. That's still unclear. But certainly if you find yourself discriminated against, impacted by this law, please contact an attorney. So that, because as as Chris mentioned, Professor Sell mentioned that one of the ways to defeat this legislation is through litigation. And if you find that that's one of the ways that the case in Florida has been challenged is through litigation, and it's made its way to the 11th Circuit of Appeals. And you can contact us, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, at info at advancingjusticeatlanta.org. But thank you so much, everyone, for the panelists, for your flexibility. We do have a feedback form as well, and I can link it here. If you can provide your feedback, we appreciate everyone's flexibility given the circumstances that were largely outside of our control. But we hope that you've gained some insight into this issue and stay engaged as a community as other possible issues arise as well. But thank you so much, everyone.